After the party, you'll sign away Grandma's cabin. It's just a formality.
Too late, Dad. At midnight, I signed the only paper that matters.
My name is Iris Tremaine, and on the night I turned 18, my father pulled me away from my own birthday party and whispered, "When everyone leaves, you're going to sign some papers for Uncle Wade. It's only a formality." I smiled as if I knew nothing. What Dad didn't know was that the most important paper had already been signed at midnight. And by sunrise, the cabin, the savings, and every investment my grandparents had left behind were protected by a legal wall my family could not break through. My uncle had already promised the cabin to a developer. My parents were counting on the money to rescue them from debt. They believed I was a Nadavi girl who could be frightened into surrendering everything. They were wrong. To understand why, you have to go back 6 years, to the summer Grandpa Harold first took me to Cedar Lake. The cabin stood beneath a ring of white pines, with a crook porch and a screen door that never closed properly. It smelled of firewood, old books, and the cinnamon tea Grandma Vivian made every afternoon. Grandpa never treated me like a child who would only get in the way. He put a hammer in my hand and taught me how to repair loose boards, clear pine needles from the roof, and check fence posts for rot. "Press your thumb into the wood," he told me. "If it gives too easily, it's finished." That evening we sat on the porch while the lake turned gold. "This place must stay in the family," he said. Then he looked at me carefully. "But remember, Iris, family isn't just blood. Family is the person who shows up." I was 12. I thought he was simply being poetic. I didn't realize he was warning me. At home, my parents saw the cabin differently. Dad called it wasted money. Mom called it an expensive responsibility. Uncle Wade, a real estate agent, called it an opportunity. Whenever I repeated Grandpa's wish, Dad laughed. "You're too young to understand business," he said. 2 years later, Grandpa died. At the funeral reception, I saw Dad and Uncle Wade speaking beside the dessert table. Wade held a folder under his arm. "We should move before probate becomes complicated," he murmured. They were discussing the cabin before the funeral flowers had even begun to wilt. Grandma Vivian lived another 2 years. During my final visit, she held my hand with surprising strength. "The cabin is yours, Iris," she whispered. "Don't let them take it. Promise me?" "I promise." After she died, Dad sat at the kitchen table and said, with relief, "Now we can finally sort out the property." That was when I understood. To me, Grandma's death was grief. To them, it was clearance. For the next 2 years, I went to Cedar Lake nearly every weekend. I patched the porch screen, replaced weather stripping, cleaned the chimney, and kept the place alive. Meanwhile, my parents stopped calling it Grandpa's cabin. They began calling it family property. Uncle Wade visited more often. He brought folders, maps, and real estate listings. Dad's building supply business was failing, and every conversation eventually returned to the same idea: sell the cabin and solve everything. One November afternoon, while cleaning a closet at Cedar Lake, I found a sealed envelope hidden behind a stack of quilts. My name was written across the front in Grandma's handwriting. Inside was a business card. Margaret Caldwell, attorney at law, Tremaine Family Trust. I slipped it into my wallet, but before I found the courage to call, Margaret contacted me herself. 3 months before my 18th birthday, I met her in a quiet office that smelled of coffee and paper. She placed a thick folder on the desk between us. "Your grandparents came to me 6 years ago," she said. "They created an irrevocable trust. The Cedar Lake cabin, a savings account, and an investment portfolio are all inside it. The total value is a little over $2 million. My mouth went dry. "Who receives it?" I asked. Margaret turned the first page toward me. My name appeared on the second line. "You are the sole beneficiary." I stared at her. "Does my father know?" "No. The cabin was transferred into the trust while your grandparents were alive. It never became part of their estate, so your father and uncle have no right to sell it." "Why didn't Grandpa tell them?" Margaret's expression softened. "He said his sons would try to sell the cabin before the funeral flowers wilted." Then she gave me the warning that changed everything. Someone had recently been asking questions about the property records. She believed my family was preparing to act. The following Sunday, Uncle Wade came for dinner. Afterward, he and Dad went into the garage. The door was slightly open, and I heard every word. "I signed the purchase agreement with Ridgeline Development," Wade said. "$450,000. We only need to record the deed." Dad sounded nervous. "What about Iris? She's 17. She can't stop anything. Give her $50,000 for college and tell her to be grateful." My hands went cold. Wade had promised to sell land he did not own. He was counting on me being too young, too frightened, and too uninformed to challenge him. That night, I sent Margaret a message. They're moving faster. Her answer arrived almost immediately. Stay calm. We will be ready. Margaret explained that as soon as I turned 18, I could formally accept my position under the trust. She would then record documents protecting the title before Wade could create any legal confusion. Should I warn my parents? I asked. Your grandfather hired me to protect you, she replied, not to negotiate with people trying to take what he left you. So I stayed quiet. 5 days before my birthday, Mom sat beside me on the couch with her gentle, rehearsed voice. The cabin is expensive to maintain, she said. Your father's business is struggling. Selling it could save our home and provide college money for you and Kelsey. Grandma wanted me to keep it. Her smile tightened. Sentiment doesn't pay taxes. Iris. Then Dad entered as if they had planned the conversation together. We already have a buyer, he said. It's a fair deal. I pretended to consider it. I'll think about it. His face relaxed. That's my girl. 3 days later, Uncle Wade cornered me in the driveway. $50,000 is a lot of money for someone your age, he said. Most kids would accept it immediately. Whose name is on the deed? I asked. For 1 second, his confident smile disappeared. Then he lied. Your grandparents' names. Now that they're gone, the property belongs to your father and me. He was a real estate agent. He knew inheritance did not work that way. But he believed I didn't. The night before my birthday, I drove to Cedar Lake alone. I sat on the old porch, listening to the water move against the shore. Grandpa used to say, patience isn't weakness, Iris. It's timing. I had always thought he was talking about fishing. For the first time, I understood. I cried quietly because I wished none of this were necessary. I wished my father saw the cabin as a place where his parents had lived, not as a number on a balance sheet. I wished my mother had asked what I wanted instead of telling me what was practical. I wished I did not need a lawyer to protect me from the people who were supposed to protect me. But wishes could not stop them. The trust could. At 11:50 that night, I opened my laptop and joined a video call with Margaret. When the clock reached midnight, she guided me through the documents. I signed my acceptance as beneficiary and returned it electronically. At 12:03 I was 18. The cabin, the accounts, and the investments were secure. The next afternoon, my birthday party filled our house with neighbors and relatives. There were balloons, a silver banner, and a cake from the bakery on Main Street. Dad stood beside the cake and tapped his glass. Iris is officially an adult, he announced. And our family has made an important decision. We're selling the Cedar Lake cabin to secure everyone's future. He turned to me, smiling in front of 20 witnesses. You understand this is best, don't you, sweetheart? The room became silent. I placed my fork on the plate. I never agreed to sell the cabin. Dad's smile froze. Uncle Wade stepped forward. This isn't the time or place, Iris. You're right, I said. The time is 8 o'clock tomorrow morning. The guests began leaving soon afterward. When the front door closed behind the last neighbor, Mom turned on me. Your father may lose this house, she said. If you loved your family, you wouldn't need a lawyer to tell you what to do. I stared at her. How do you know I have a lawyer? Wade found Margaret Caldwell's card in your bag. They had searched my belongings. Dad sat at the kitchen table and folded his hands. Here is what will happen, he said. Tomorrow, Wade and I will record the paperwork. The cabin will sell. You will receive $50,000, and we will move forward as a family. And if I refuse, his voice turned cold, then you're on your own. No college help. No place in this house. You're threatening to throw me out on my 18th birthday. I'm asking you to act like part of this family. I stood, even though my hands were trembling. I am part of this family, Dad. I'm the part that keeps promises. At 8 the next morning, Margaret was the first person inside the county recorder's office. She presented the trust documents and recorded formal notice of its legal interest in the Cedar Lake property. At 8:14, she called me. It's done, she said. The title is protected. At 9:05, Dad and Uncle Wade walked into the same office. Wade confidently pushed his quitclaim deed across the counter. The clerk checked the parcel number and shook her head. I cannot record this. The property belongs to the Tremaine Family Trust. Wade went pale. That's impossible. The transfer was recorded 6 years ago. The clerk replied. Your document does not match the chain of title. Dad turned toward his brother. You said this was simple. Wade had no answer. My phone rang 17 minutes later. What did you do? Dad demanded. I accepted what Grandpa and Grandma left me. That property belonged to my parents. I'm their son. And they chose to leave it to me, not because they didn't love you, but because they didn't trust you with it. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then he said, "We'll fight this. You can try. But the trust is irrevocable, Dad. I've spent 3 months learning exactly what that means." He ended the call. Minutes later, Ridgeline Development contacted me. I explained that Wade had never owned the property and never had the authority to sell it. Would the trust consider a direct offer? Their representative asked. The cabin is not for sale. His answer was brief. Then we will pursue your uncle for breach of contract. That afternoon, Margaret discovered something worse. The deed Wade tried to record carried a false notary stamp. What had begun as greed had crossed into possible fraud. When Dad came home, he looked smaller than he had the day before. The bank wants $180,000, he said. The store is failing. That cabin was supposed to save us. I'm sorry about the business, I told him. But the cabin was never yours to sacrifice. What does an 18-year-old need with a lakefront property? This isn't about what I need. It's about what Grandma and Grandpa wanted. Dad threatened to contest the trust. But Margaret explained that it had been created while my grandparents were healthy, witnessed properly, and recorded years before their deaths. Fighting it would cost him money he did not have, with almost no chance of success. Within weeks, Uncle Wade faced a lawsuit from Ridgeline. His real estate license was suspended while the false notary stamp was investigated. Dad sold his struggling store at a loss and negotiated a repayment plan with the bank. A mom returned to work at the pharmacy where she had worked years earlier. None of it felt like victory. I had protected what my grandparents left me, but the truth had torn open every quiet wound in our family. The one Saturday in late April, I returned to Cedar Lake. Inside the cabin, everything was as I remembered: Grandpa's handmade kitchen table, Grandma's books arranged by color, and the porch chairs facing the water. In a desk drawer, I found one final envelope with my name written in Grandpa's hand. His letter was only 1 page. He wrote that he loved both of his sons, but they had never understood the difference between something that had value and something that was valuable. He chose me because I was the one who asked whether the roof needed repairing before I ever asked what the land was worth. His final sentence said, "Take care of this place. It took care of you first." I pressed the letter against my chest and cried. A week later, Margaret told me that my grandparents had also created a separate college fund. They had deposited $50,000 into it 6 years earlier. With interest, it was now worth more than $58,000. It was the same amount my family had offered me as a tiny share of the sale, but my grandparents had already provided it without taking anything away from me. "They would be proud of you," Margaret said. I only kept my promise. I enrolled in environmental science at a college near Cedar Lake and moved into the cabin. Before leaving my parents' house, I asked Mom and Dad to meet me at a coffee shop. "I love you," I told them. "But the cabin is not for sale. If we are going to have a relationship, it must be based on respect, not guilt, money, or threats." Dad stared into his cup for a long time. "I don't know how to fix this," he finally said. "You don't have to fix it today. You only have to start telling the truth." My younger sister, Kelsey, visited the cabin a few weeks later with a pepperoni pizza. We sat on the porch while a heron stood motionless in the shallow water. "Was I part of the problem?" she asked softly. I looked at her and saw the same frightened child I had once been. "No, Kels. We were both children. None of this was your fault." She leaned her head against my shoulder. "Can I come back? Anytime?" That was when I understood the cabin had protected more than an inheritance. It had created a place where something broken might slowly begin to heal. Now, early in the morning, I sit on the same porch where Grandpa taught me about patience. Mist rises from Cedar Lake, and the pines become clear as the sun climbs above the water. I did not win against my family. There is no real victory when the people who hurt you are the people who were supposed to protect you. But I kept a promise. My grandparents saw the storm before I did, and they built shelter before I knew I would need it. They could not stop my father's desperation, my mother's fear, or my uncle's greed. But they gave me solid ground on which to stand. Grandpa was right. Some things have a price, and some things have a meaning. The cabin has both, but only one of them truly matters. Peace did not come from watching my uncle face consequences. It did not come from proving my parents wrong. It came from standing on that porch, holding Grandpa's letter, and knowing I had protected something love created. Sometimes strength does not look like shouting. Sometimes it looks like remaining quiet until the right moment. Sometimes the person everyone underestimates is the only one who understands what is truly at stake, And sometimes the last paper is the only one that matters.